Started. Okay, so we've got our group here to start off with, and this will be our first class on Screwtape letters. Some of you just picked up the book today, so we're not actually going to do chapter one. We'll wait. Chapter one will wait for next Wednesday. Some books we have a little introductory or background or context. Some books we don't. You just sort of jump right into it. This book absolutely and positively requires an introduction. And I will tell you why. I love this book. It's a fantastic book. It's imaginative, it's funny, it's interesting, it's thought-provoking, it's cool, it's all sorts of great stuff. Every single time I do this class, somebody gets upset. Somebody gets very burdened and worried, and it makes them feel bad. And it's because of the nature of the book. It's the genre. It's not that the book is bad. You just need a little preparation, a little forethought, and you need to know what to expect and how to read it. So I wanted to take some very purposeful time for us and for anybody who might be watching online or after the fact to talk about the nature of the book fairly thoroughly, to do what I can to mitigate anyone's discomfort later or worry or anxiety. And if it sounds like I'm pumping this up too much and like, what are we doing? Are we opening up a book that something going to come out? And no. It's within the imaginative creativity of the book that, since it was written, has been throwing people for a loop if you don't pay attention to what it's saying and doing. Once you kind of get into a rhythm, you'll have no problem with it. But you might take a minute to the first chapter or so to wrap your head around how to read it. So this is C.S. Lewis. It's going to be faithfully Christian. It's going to be very imaginative. It's going to offer some occasionally heavy theological concepts presented in a very simple, straightforward and understandable manner. But it is the style and the genre of literature that really takes some thinking through. So it's typically referred to in two somewhat technical ways. Okay, one is a theological fantasy. So there's a theological basis for it. Everything that he writes has a kind of a scriptural, traditional Christian underpinning, but then you take those simple, solid concepts and then you write imaginings with it. So if you are a part of this class in sequential order, our very last book was Pilgrim's Progress. That too is a theological fantasy. It was one of the very first. And when you read John Bunyan's introductions or the stuff he writes about his own work, he spends a lot of time trying to explain himself and almost apologize in advance, because it almost seems unseemly to talk about such serious issues with something as tawdry as fiction. Well, that's because he's the first one to do it. And now we don't think twice about it. We don't think twice about a fictional story or a TV show or a movie that has faithful Christian themes, but it's not just reciting scripture, right? Because that's not what we do in life. We don't just, every day and every word is just a scriptural quotation. We're trying to live our lives as Christian disciples with our own unique perspectives, circumstances, the good things, bad things, and the ways that we all individually sort of muddle through. So the theological fantasy part it is obviously fictional, and it is intended to be a little fantastical in its premise. And that's the other sometimes technical term for the genre is in its premise, the satirical epistolary. And you got to unpack that a little bit. So satirical means it's exaggerated, it's humorous, it's intended to be big, broad, bold strokes in order to make a point. That's what satire does, right? You sort of raise a somewhat serious issue by making a big crazy joke about it, right? So that's the satire part. And epistolary is a genre of literature that involves the writing or reading of letters. So, did anyone remember seeing, because like it seemed like back in the was it, like the late 90s or the early 2000s, everybody had seen this movie, The Notebook. And so you've got like this pair of couples, the young couple and the older couple, and the guy who finds this notebook and he's reading like diary entries, and you're kind of flashing back and forth between this younger couple and their tribulations and their this love story that kind of goes up and down. And then, spoiler alert, the young couple turns out to be the old couple. It was them all along. But the idea is, as the main character is reading this love story, and it's so moving and so profound, and you're seeing it acted out by the younger couple, you are taking what's written and you're reading between the lines. Imagine reading someone's diary, when people still did that. I don't think kids do that anymore. But imagine when you read a diary entry, there's a couple of things that you keep in mind. Number one, it's not telling absolutely everything. It's just whatever the person happens to write down. And number two, whose perspective is it written from? Only the person who's writing the diary. You know, if you were to take as the absolute honest truth how a 13-year-old girl described her math teacher, you might be surprised to meet the math teacher in person and realize, I think your own perspective was kind of coloring your description a little bit, right? And I've been around a few 13-year-old girls in my time, you might have one letter where they're talking about a person in glowing terms as their best friend, and you skip forward a few pages and that same person is terrible and they're mean and you can't trust them. Well, what's the truth in that? It's probably somewhere in between, but what do you think happened between one diary entry, my BFF, and my second entry, that snake in the grass who can't be trusted? What might have happened in between?
Did something to step on her toes.
Something, yeah. And so sometimes that is a complete mystery, but you know obviously something must have happened. Sometimes you can piece the clues together. Perhaps a boy might have been mentioned on one page, and now on the next page, that boy's a jerk too. I wonder. Look, right? So when you read letters, and that is a genre of fiction, you can find entire novels that are written that way, or portions of a novel that are written that way. Scripture itself, okay, the majority of the New Testament are epistles. An epistle simply means letter. So for instance, when we are reading from 1 Corinthians, we are reading from Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. Paul knew these people, he worked with these people, he lived with these people, he loved those people. He brought the gospel to that place, to that little community there in Greece, and then he left to go on another missionary mission. Well, when you can just read the letter, start from the beginning and work all the way through, but when you understand the context, you start thinking through some of these questions. Why did he write the letter? There must have been something going on. Because the letter's not, hey, how you doing? Miss ya. That'd be quick and easy, but you know, 1 Corinthians is somewhat long. So when you start reading between the lines, you read, what are some of the things that he brings up in 1 Corinthians? Well, we had a reading just last Sunday. I hear from Chloe's people that there is dissension among you. Some of you say, I belong to Paul. Some of you say, I belong to Apollos. Some of you say, I belong to Christ. Were you baptized in the name of Apollos? Did Paul die for you? Now, he doesn't explicitly state what the issue was. Can you guess? They must have been fighting. They must have been arguing. They must have been arguing in such a way where they were trying to one-up each other, and they were trying to make comparisons about who was the more faithful Christian based on who they were connected to. He doesn't have to spell it out exactly what happened. This person said this person did that. But you read through his response, you read through his letter, and you can kind of think backwards to sort of fill in the gaps about what must be going on. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So in an epistolary, you only get one side of the conversation typically. And we know it's a conversation because think of the Bible again. Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians. Why do we call it First Corinthians?
Because it wasn't the last.
Because he has to write a second one. You know, well, let's do this again. So there's some sort of back and forth going on, but we only get Paul's side of the story. We don't get the first letter of the Corinthians to Paul. And so you have to kind of think through when you read a letter, it is coming from one person's perspective only. And it's intended to spark your imagination to think through what must be going on when he makes a reference to something, but he doesn't explain it exactly. So we will catch in this, it could be a news event, a cultural condition. It could be something that happens in the life of a person, and it will be referred to somewhat offhandedly or obliquely. And that's where our imaginations are supposed to kick in. We read between the lines and we try to extrapolate whatever circumstance is happening in order to correspond with the letter. You follow me so far? Mm-hmm. Now, all of this would be relatively straightforward if not for the real twist. This is the real twist of the book, and this is why it takes explanation, unpacking, and preparation, because of who is writing the letter and to whom, for what purpose. These are called the Screwtape letters because the author of each letter is Screwtape, and Screwtape is a demon. Screwtape the demon. Screwtape the more advanced, more senior demon is writing letters to a novice, newbie demon, his nephew Wormwood. So that's the real twist and trick and imaginative part, but it's also the part that throws a lot of people off. So working backwards with the fact that it's epistolary and understanding who the author is, what sort of things do you think one demon might write to another demon?
How to be a better demon.
How to be a better demon. Does that sound like it's going to be good, nice, happy, and flower, you know, right? So there are complaints, you know, for decades, like when this was first produced, of people saying, well, how dare you write, you know, such mean-spirited things. I read your advice and it's diabolical. And he's kind of like,
You got it.
right. It's supposed to be. He's the bad guy.
Yeah.
So let me, you know, circle around a little bit to say there are other elements of literature that are present here. We could very rightly call Screwtape the protagonist of this story. We could also even call Wormwood, his nephew, the protagonist, in the sense of Screwtape is getting reports from his nephew. Well, this is what I did. I am trying to actively tempt and destroy a human. Because doesn't that make sense that if there's some sort of job that demons are responsible for, it's the corruption of people? Yeah. Well, if you're new at your job of corrupting a person, you might not get it the first time. You might have trouble corrupting them. And what if they resist or they don't listen or something, you know? So if I'm a newbie, if I'm you know, early on in this, and I'm trying to learn and get better, I might ask a more senior demon, especially my uncle, for some advice. So if I say, well, such and such happened, what do I do? Well, the uncle will then give advice about how he can be more successful in corrupting this human a little better. Now, does that sound like advice that we ought to follow?
No.
No. So remember, please, that a protagonist of a work is simply a point of view main character. It's not the good guy, and it's not the hero. Now, generally speaking, that's often the case, that the protagonist is the hero or is the good guy. This is one of the cases where that's not the case. The main character here is either Screwtape or it's Wormwood, explain, and we're getting that secondhand through Screwtape's own letters. But remember that the advice that is good advice is in essence bad advice. This is the principle of moral inversion. Screwtape, as the narrator, is a bad guy. He's actually not a guy at all. He is a demon. He is not interested in doing good to us. He is interested in our corruption and destruction. So when he says, you ought to do such and such, it's probably best if we do the exact opposite. Right?
It's counterintuitive.
It's counterintuitive, and it will trip people up, especially early on. Maybe the first chapter or so, you're going to have to kind of circle back around and concentrate on, everything needs to be read almost upside down. And it's going to throw people off a little bit because there's a few things that will come up repeatedly, but are pretty significant and very interesting when you think about it. And one of them will be this. Screwtape the demon will often give advice about how to deal with the enemy. Big capital E. The enemy. Now, as we're preparing to read, who do you think is the enemy of demons?
Believers.
So when he talks about the enemy with a capital E, he's talking about God. He will occasionally refer to Satan, but usually with a title like Our Father Below. Creepy, but interesting, kind of thought-provoking, right? Now, but remember, this is a backwards point of view. The moral inversion means we are listening in to conversations between villains, right? And we expect villains to say villainous things. It is proper and correct for villains to say villainous things. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to make too much of an issue, but I just want it very, very clear that I am not saying the stuff that happens in this, like when it gives advice about how people ought to behave and act, we should be doing the opposite of this. And it's usually fairly clear. He's not really trying to trick you. It's very straightforward. We just need to keep that in mind. So here's another little literary nugget. As a narrator, Screwtape is what we refer to as a unreliable narrator. And maybe you've come across books like that or a movie like that. There are a few famous examples where you basically get to the end and there's some sort of revelation that you have been lied to in the book. Whoever's been explaining to you what was going on was actually hiding something very significant and not telling you the truth. And it can be a fun twist, especially in a murder mystery or something like that. But that literary device is referred to as the unreliable narrator. And it means that the narrator, even when they swear up and down or telling the truth, maybe they are, maybe they're not. You cannot rely on what they say to be the absolute truth. This is back into the nature of a demon. And as we are reading this and are able to discuss it in thinking about the nature of evil and spiritual evil, it's going to, I think, help us raise some other very interesting theological concepts and topics. Ultimately, Screwtape, through his actions, through his advice, through his career in hell, is trying to please Satan. Or perhaps ultimately, he's really just trying to please himself. So imagine there is a deep and everlasting self-centeredness in everything that we're reading. For what is more hellish than to be so self-absorbed that you even exclude God? So this is a part of getting used to reading the book, that some people will pick it up, start reading, they will become alarmed because, they're just not thinking that they have to read it, like it's opposite day. And they start, oh, this thing is, it's saying all these terrible things, and I'm very disturbed. And I don't mean foolish people. I mean, I've had some very, very sharp, even very faithful people say like, oh man, I hate that book. I couldn't get past a couple of chapters. I love this book. I've read it, a bunch of times for many, many years. But there is something to the preparation and the perspective. So when you have that in mind, then you can start unpacking a little bit of the wider context, and it's actually pretty fun. So I've already talked about, the job of a demon, right? Well, imagine, if you will, that hell is sort of a giant bureaucracy. And when we deal with human bureaucracies, we often compare them in hellish terms. So imagine, if you will, that the business of hell, the corruption of humanity, the destruction of creation, the perversion of all that is good, has this sort of mind-numbing, grinding, petty, layer upon layer bureaucracy, almost like an infernal DMV. And Wormwood happens to be kind of like middle management. And Screwtape happens to be like either a new hire or an intern or just kind of a very low-level employee. So what's every goal of a low-level employee in a giant bureaucracy?
Get promoted.
Work your way up. And what's the job or goal of every middle manager in a bureaucracy?
Become a CEO.
Either move to the top or at least stay where I am. Right?
Yep.
So we'll get a little bit of this as we go along, and you're going to get this sense of a very bureaucratic, pencil pushing, paper punching sort of element, which is actually kind of fun. But when we think about it, we're always going to be able to take even some of the very offhanded or silly things and tie it back into some deeper themes. So one of the things that can be so frustrating about working with a human bureaucracy, right, is that it seems so completely impersonal. Nobody cares. Nobody moves. They're all just in it for themselves. And it's like shouting at a brick wall sometimes. So as we're talking about the bureaucracy of hell, we can start taking some of our own experiences and thinking through the theological implications of a hell which is ultimately self-centered, a hell which is ultimately deaf to cries of help or need, a hell which is layers upon layers of confusion, manipulation, dead ends, right? All these things sort of start to fit when you use the theological fantasy part of it, and you kind of imagine some of the connections and some of the themes. Is this all kind of, so remember I said that, as middle management, Screwtape is interested in either kind of climbing the ladder or at least staying where he is. And I said that he's about pleasing his boss, our father below, Satan, the devil, or ultimately he's about pleasing himself. And remember that he's also unreliable. We can't take what he says as actually being true and accurate. If it's your job to make yourself look good in the eyes of your boss, do you tell the unvarnished truth? Or do you always kind of puff up the good parts and minimize the negatives? And there will be some of that too. You'll hear about how powerful and profound hell is, how weak and ineffectual and stupid God is. But again, imagine, what do you think a demon's going to say? What do you think a demon's perspective will be? What do you think in a bureaucratic hell, Satan expects his minions to act like? And so this is all just kind of, it's all in the mix, but I say some of these things up front just because of years of experience tells me that people are going to start reading this and start getting troubled unless they're going in feeling a little better prepared. So in that preparation, let me also start with an extremely significant but very fundamental theological, I'm not even going to call it a premise, it's a theological truth. Okay. What or who is the opposite of God?
Good and evil.
There is no opposite of God. There is no opposite of God. I say that as a theological and intellectual truth. Everything that we would categorize, throw in the box of evil or bad or corrupt or whatever, it has to take something else first and change it. Without the creative power of God, which is good, there is no evil. Not in a yin and a yang balance, because without the good, there is no creation for bad to corrupt. So it must take a secondary and subordinate role always. Satan himself is a created being. You might want to, speak in terms of, evil is the absence of good, like darkness is the absence of light. Unfortunately, though, again, what are we talking about that's bad or evil? And isn't it simply taking that which has already been done, which God has proclaimed to be good, and then twisting it, changing it, making it dirty, perverted, overemphasizing the wrong things, whatever it is? Even in darkness, there's no concept of darkness unless there is light first, because we have the ability to see and to process. We try to bifurcate light and darkness, but ultimately, it's like those who are born blind don't talk about darkness because they have nothing to compare it to. Their senses don't work that way because darkness, like evil, it is the change of something that is into something that it, in essence, shouldn't be. The opposite of God simply doesn't exist, because all that there is coming from God and anything we would want to attribute to evil doesn't occur without him first. The opposite of Jesus is not Satan. Again, in the Trinitarian understanding of the nature of God, with the fullness of humanity and the deity within the incarnation, that is still also not an oppositional figure to Satan. Lewis suggests, and he's not unique to do this, that if you really want to, it just works in your brain to find opposites, a much closer opposite to Satan would be the Archangel Michael. Okay, created angelic beings of an exceptionally high order. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that, we can try to imagine and sort of speculate through our theological, imaginations through scripture, but Satan is always in a subordinate role, seeking to corrupt or destroy that which he cannot make. Okay, the devil makes jack. All the devil can do is screw stuff up. As a matter of fact, the one of the very familiar terms that we often associate as more of a proper name or description is Satan, which is coming from the Hebrew Satan, which roughly translates to something like the accuser. You can see that role as an accuser in a place like the book of Job, where Satan is just kind of wandering and gnawing. He's just like imagining somebody who's just, they're in a perpetual bad mood with a chip on their shoulder, just looking to stir junk up, right? This is the Joker from the Dark Knight movie, where it says, some people just want to watch the world burn. He's not in it for the money. He just wants to watch the world burn. Some people are, it's like, you ever met somebody who seems angry that they were born?
Yep.
Extrapolate that out by this unimaginable amount. And even in the book of Job, Satan is there sort of within the heavenly court to simply say, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Impotent, powerless, only capable of doing what God allows. Remember, he basically has to get permission to fulfill this wager, because he says, there's nobody who loves you, God, just because. They only love you because you give them good things. God knows better. But he says, knock yourself out, you'll see. But this isn't something that Satan had the power to do on his own, but is, even when he shakes his fist at God, is still basically a lackey, a flunky, definitely a subordinate. So we will be able to, talk about some of these spiritual things and spiritual beings and the spiritual world and life, and how these things might all intersect, especially with our normal day-to-day life. And that's one of the really neat things about the book, is that it's coming from a very spiritual perspective, just taking the concepts of the spirit world and spiritual warfare completely for granted, because these are two demons talking to each other. But what are they talking about but the ordinary life of an ordinary person? Someone who does not perceive some cosmic clash between heaven and hell. They're just kind of living their life the best way they can, without the ability to perceive what's happening all around them at all times. An eminently scriptural perspective. We often come up with images. We start thinking about spiritual beings, spiritual forces, the devil. You see, what does the devil look like? And maybe you think pitchforks, and the horns and cloven feet. Maybe you think more of the dapper but sinister gentleman of Mephistopheles, or whatever. So there's a bunch of these that Lewis will write about, and one of the, I don't think you have a fuller preface, but he'll write about it in the older one. And he thinks that this concept of like the dapper gentleman with his sinister twists and plots has actually been more harmful to people, because it basically humanizes the devil in a way that scripture does not seem to allow for. The cleverness, the humor, the sophistication. When we think about the nature of evil, taking something which is good and corrupting it, and then the hunger for others to be corrupted as well. There's nothing dapper or funny about that. There's nothing sophisticated about that. for those of you who read um, Paralandra, the second part of the space trilogy, some time ago, maybe last year or so. Maybe the most frightening part where the other scientist is now truly gone and is fully possessed by a demonic spirit, or even perhaps the demonic spirit. And it's brutal in its animalism, where when it attacks Ransom, it's all claws and teeth. But when he does talk, it's taunts, it's jeers, it's nasty, it's stupid, it's incessant, it repeats over and over and over again. And when we think about what is that which is good, what has God made? It is the creativity of God to make creation. Well, how do you pervert creativity? The intelligence and intellect which could make order out of nothing. You pervert that. What does a perverted, broken, corrupted intellect look like? So the one thing that Lewis does seem to agree, he doesn't like Milton's portrayal of the devil, but I think there's a few things about, basically better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. So that profoundly and irrevocably self-centered purpose, that would be good. But also about the devil's lack of a sense of humor. And there's an opening quotation, I think, in our first chapter. I think it might be the Spencer quotation about how he's a proud spirit and cannot bear to be mocked. The devil has no sense of humor. Well, why? Well, because sense of humor, Lewis wrote this, I tried to scribble a couple of notes, because humor requires a sense of proportion and the ability to look outside of yourself. And if you lack those things, you really can't be humorous or joking or funny. It's actually implicit. We don't think about it in those terms, but it's true. Instead, hell is not this sort of seductively corrupting influence so much as it is this fully and completely self-centered place where everyone is only concerned about themselves, and they are perpetually aggrieved, and they're angry, and it's your fault and it's not mine, and what about me? What about my rights? What about this? When we consider what separates us from each other, what separates us from the presence of God, but it is that deep, perverse, corrupted sense of self-importance. It's only being able to see things from our point of view. It's only being able to want what we want right then and right there and nothing else.
And blame everybody else.
And blame everybody else.
When it doesn't
'cause
work
it's obviously never your fault.
No.
Right? And so if this sounds like I'm downplaying the role or the ability or the perniciousness or power of evil, maybe the most famous quote that Lewis has about this book, but not actually in this book, this: there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. So he's kind of taking it for granted that when Scripture teaches about demons, when Scripture teaches about the devil, that it's not metaphor. It's not just poetic imagery. But he always desires to keep it in proportion. And that's where saying something like God has no opposite is both a philosophical and theological truth, but it also gains its practicality in the sense of this is not a contest of equals. Satan is perpetually striving against God, right? But this is the flea striving against the elephant. You know, the flea can be really ticked off and I'll get you this time, but it doesn't move the elephant ever at all, right? And yet taking things in proper proportion, if demons are these spiritual beings and evil cannot create anything, then these spiritual beings at one point were good, perhaps angelic. That is a general typical rendering that the demon is a fallen angel. Satan himself, when I said, his, rough equivalent is probably someone like the Archangel Michael, who has a very specific purpose, who has a very high reckoning within the hierarchy of heaven. That when an angel ever shows up in the Bible, what's the first thing they have to say?
Fear not.
Fear not. Don't panic. Stop freaking out. Why?
Probably scary.
It's got to be overwhelming. A spiritual being is kind of beyond our rational human capacity.
Yeah, it's not
And
Yeah.
there's I don't know why it gained popularity, but there was a bunch of memes this year about biblically accurate angel tree toppers on your Christmas tree. And so it's this crazy Ezekiel wheel within a wheel with a million eyes and wings sprouting off in every direction. But if you remember, some of the very few physical descriptions we're given have things like multiple wings, where the seraphim before the throne of God have wings covering their face and covering their feet. And I mean, so this sense of wings is the chubby baby with the little cherub wings is not just a human kind of approximation, but probably a terribly gross misrepresentation. Angelic beings and what they actually look like, I couldn't exactly tell you. Perhaps there is some sort of understanding of a presence that is somehow comprehensible to us as roughly human or humanoid. But every single time an angel shows up and interacts in Scripture, they have to tell people to calm the heck down. There must be something about their presence that is just overwhelming, if not terrifying. That sense of the overwhelming, well, what happens when it falls? What happens when it's corrupt? What happens when there is some way for that angelic being to turn from its creator and to seek to serve itself alone? Still probably overwhelming, still probably terrifying, maybe even more so in different kinds of ways. Because it's one thing for something to show up that is breaking your brain and it says, fear not, I come to bring you good news. And it would probably be something else for something to show up and it's breaking your brain and it says, I'm coming for you. Right? So all of these things are kind of floating in the mix. I definitely want to respect Lewis's desire and perspective that there's a proportionality to this. We neither should be terrified, nor should we be dismissive and ignorant. Basically, he says there's when the pendulum swings too far is when you get yourself in trouble on this. When you deny any existence of malevolent spirituality, you open yourself up to all sorts of stuff. It's like trying to walk through a minefield with your eyes closed. But when you get too into it, too interested, you open yourself up to things and to issues that perhaps you ought to be closed to. The dabbling magician sometimes gazes into the abyss and is never able to come back. A healthy sense of proportion and balance is I think what Lewis would want us to take as we are considering, these are kind of big ticket items here, but he's taking these big issues, life and death and discipleship, the eternal fate of a soul. And it's kind of humorous, and it's kind of fun, and it's kind of light, but it's not any less important. So we'll have the opportunity to think about what opposites mean, and, well, if he's saying one thing, what do we think it actually means, and what would be the Christian equivalent, or, whatever it is. So this is just how we can be prepared to go through the book and not feel like we need to blink twice and shake our head at every sentence.
I'm not gonna give us nightmares, is it?
No. It's not a scary book. It's humorous. It's jovial. It's actually quite lighthearted in many ways. It's just, again, it's written by the bad guy, and it's written for a bad purpose, except it's not, because ultimately it's not a bad guy writing this. It's a good guy. C.S. Lewis is a good, godly man, and he is always in control of Screwtape's pen. Yeah. And what he does is, through satire, through exaggeration, through some sly humor, he's actually helping us make some really, really good points. Mm-hmm. We just have to maybe be ready for the exaggeration and for the sly humor.
I noticed he dedicated it to Tolkien.
He did, and Tolkien was ticked.
Mm-hmm.
As the story goes, Tolkien was very unhappy about that, because he did not like this book, and he didn't like the idea of it, and he didn't like the execution of it, and he was annoyed at his buddy Jack for making the dedication to him. And C.S. Lewis was basically like, in many ways, I was the subject of, being corrupted and on the edge. Will I make it or will I not? And it was his friends that he met, like Tolkien, who helped bring him to Christ. And so C.S. Lewis thought, well, this is a way I can, show that gratitude. And Tolkien was like, dang it, why that book? Give me a better book to dedicate to.
Give me the line in which is
Right.
the wardrobe.
I didn't like that one either. He didn't. That he hated the. He said it was too messy. He pulled in too many, like, well, why you're mixing Greek gods and goddesses with talking animals, and then Father Christmas shows up, and it's a mess, Jack. It's a mess. But that just goes to show these were two faithful Christians who cared very deeply for each other, but were able to really rake each other over the coals, especially about their own works. But iron sharpens iron. And because of that little discussion group, the Inklings, these luminary figures actually became better at what they did and what they wrote, because their buddies were willing to tear them down.
Yeah, make them accountable, yeah, for sure. Get them thinking.
All right, anything else? What I've done is I wrote this out so that people can have it for later, but it's roughly what it's a concisely written version of what I basically told you guys as an introduction. That's the front page, and the back page are 4 different scriptural passages from the New Testament, but kind of grounding us in the nature of evil. And I would encourage you to, just read over it at some point. And when in doubt, if you start reading something and you're confused by it, refer back to this real quick, and it may just answer your question for you. And we'll talk about it. That's what the class is going to be for, is for us to talk about what we thought of it, or how it occurred to us, or whatever it is. This was to be kind of a resource, just to make sure that anybody who was starting to feel a little twitchy about it, you read that first and make sure that we're still on the same page, and then we'll talk through whatever we need to.
Upset about the great divorce.
So yeah, again, another theological fantasy. He's not trying to say this is absolutely how things operate. He's using his imagination to make suggestions about, well, what if something looked like this? This is how we could understand those underlying principles. So he's not trying to suggest that there is the DMV is in hell. He's just saying, well, you know, if you use your imagination and think through how must things be like, well, I can kind of see it sort of like waiting in a real long line, and it's real miserable and it's hot and people keep pestering you, and you get to the front of the line and they tell you you're in the wrong line and now you got to go to the other line and that's even longer, and you know, that sort of thing. The constant petty injustices and annoyances. So anyway, I hope I have not dissuaded anyone or made you too wary. That's not my goal. My goal is not have you on your guard like, oh my gosh, this book, I don't know if I can make it. Like, no. It's actually super light reading. It really is. Again, it's just every time I have done this class, I've had somebody get upset. And so I'm a little maybe overly cautious to make sure that everybody understands, you know, what we're.
Okay, I'll be upset, so nobody else.
There you, thank you, Morgan. Thank you.
We've only read it 3 or 4 times.
It's all her fault.
All her fault. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions?
No, I'm excited.
Now it's going to go fairly quick. These letters, the letters, they're not very long.
Yeah.
They're like a couple of pages each.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just got the book Monday and I read 3 or 4 of the letters
Yeah. So
that evening.
I am we can be flexible about this, about how many letters we read per week that we want to talk about. The issue is not going to be, can you read, you know, 2 letters in a week or 3 letters in a week? You definitely can. They're like 2 pages each. The question will be in our discussion, you know, the topics that we bring up, how many is a good amount for a single class? So I'm going to make a rough suggestion. How about we take 2 letters, chapters 1 and 2 for next Wednesday. If it feels like the right amount, great. If it feels too short, next time we'll add more. If it feels like too much, we just won't finish and we'll pick it up the next time. But that way, because they are short, I want to kind of have a feel for how we work as a group on the letters themselves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do the first 2 letters, 1 and 2, and we will talk about that next Wednesday.
And that's Ash Wednesday.
No, next Wednesday is not Ash Wednesday.
No.
Ash Wednesday will be in, near the end of the month. The 22nd, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we good? All right. Thank you very much.
We're good.